Okay, post-league wrap up. Okay, so I mean 3-2. It's definitely not the glory days of the 5-0 that we got the first time we played a Svyelun deck without a companion. By the way, I did try once with Svyelun and in a Urion build. Yeah. So okay, what's the takeaway here? Like, it's not as impressive. Here's the thing, though. I mean, in any of those games, maybe I'm missing something. So let me know if you think I'm missing something. But I don't think Repeal would have made any of those losses a win. I mean, there are some matchups, like for example the humans matchup. I mean, maybe I don't think they had Aether Vial that game one that I think we had Spreading Seas in our hand for a while. Like there are some matchups, granted, like humans, spirits, like the Aether Vial matchups. That's one of the only matchups that Repeal is utterly insane against, because bouncing their Aether Vial, especially when you have your own Aether Vial, it's just an unbelievable tempo play. Like, honestly, it's better than destroying the Aether Vial, because like if you draw a card and you set it back, you might as well have destroyed it, because Aether Vial loses its value the longer the game goes, because the more they just have to play the creatures naturally, the less they're going to be able to cheat creatures into play, and the less value they get out of Aether Vial. So I can't complain. I think the deck. So also Svyelun, like I was thinking maybe this might push Merfolk into tier 1, but let's not kid ourselves. I really, the best of the format is just going so nuts right now. I think Svyelun just basically allows Merfolk to stay tier 2 instead of sliding into tier 3, and I hate to say that. Look, I love Merfolk, and I think Merfolk can still do very well, and I think Merfolk can still beat up a lot of tier 1 decks. Don't ever let players tell you that you shouldn't play a tier 2 deck. I mean, like in the fighting game community, there's tons and tons of players who win constantly with tier 2 or even tier 3 characters. Maybe tier 2 is more fair. Maybe not constantly with tier 3, but every once in a while they surprise. Like, I think somebody even won with Yoshi in Smash Brothers Brawl. I don't necessarily follow that scene competitively, but I watched a YouTube video, and I think Amsa was the name anyway. So, like, so some people play some weird characters like Yoshi out of nowhere, and then Yoshi definitely seemed like a jank character back when I used to play Brawl somewhat. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is you shouldn't be discouraged from playing a deck just because it's not tier 1. Because here's the thing also, and this is also something kind of known in the fighting game community, the tier 2, or sometimes even tier 3 characters, sometimes they can kind of make up for their less intrinsic power by the fact that the opponent is not as familiar playing against them. That actually does count for a lot. If you have a lot more familiarity with the opponent's deck than they do yours, that does give you an advantage. And they can always say, oh, well, I just need to learn the matchup more. But you see, at the end of the day, though, like, people don't have infinite time to constantly be studying every single deck, which is why you hear the complaint a lot about people playing tier 2 or tier 3 decks, where people are like, how was I supposed to be prepared for this jank? I mean, they say that because the reality is that they're frustrated that they don't have infinite time to learn like every single matchup, so they just didn't prepare. They probably could have. Sometimes they could have won if they would have just, known them, been more familiar with the matchup, got more reps in. But Modern has such an almost infinite amount of decks that you cannot spend the time to just go over every single one. So, so I mean, obviously they're being salty, but like there's a logic behind the salt. It doesn't mean like it's good to be salty, but it does mean, like if you ever heard somebody complain about you playing a tier 2 deck, don't take it personally. It's not ultimately them just being assholes for no reason. It's actually just confirming that you're gaining a hidden advantage by playing a tier 2 deck. So all of that to say is I like Merfolk. I still want to play it. I still think it's a barrel of fun. But Svyelun is, I don't think, pushing it to tier 1 like I thought. Like I thought for maybe a second, maybe it might. But I do think it's going to help us keep pace and at least keep relatively the same power level. Now that, I mean, the rest of the format got so much bonkers cards that I guess we were overdue for one too. It'd just be nice if once in a while we could get like I don't know, a 1-mana 1/1 Merfolk when it comes into play draws a card. Whenever another Merfolk comes into play, this card gets +1/+1. So basically a strictly better Champion of the Parish in the Merfolk tribe. I mean, we could only dream. Honestly, that card would be so... Yeah, it would only trigger on Merfolk, though, so only Merfolk decks could really play it. Actually, that's the thing, man. I'm telling you, Svyelun is actually really powerful. But I think some decks might catch on that you can totally play this in a non-Merfolk deck. I mean, 3 mana for a 3/4 when it attacks, draw a card, even without any of the other abilities. That's actually very underrated. I mean, some people still play Ryok's Warmonk. I mean, not that many. 3 mana for a 3/4 lifelink. Granted, you don't see that often, but I'm telling you, 3 mana for a 3/4 is a respectable body. and drawing a card every single turn, to say that's respectable is kind of an understatement. So I'm telling you, so we might see this pop up in non-Merfolk decks, because you totally don't actually need to play Merfolk for this to be a decent card. This is totally a decent, powerful card, just even with no Merfolk support. Which honestly is why the card is so good even in our deck, because we don't always have Merfolk support. But that also means you can play it in a non-Merfolk deck, in my opinion. Anyway, I don't know what else to say. The rest of the deck is the same as last time. I think 8 Cs is conceptually solid. You will win some games by mana screwing the opponent, and yeah, I don't think, you know, like, I'm not so-called results oriented. So please correct me if I'm mistaken. And by the way, I need to actually like discipline myself in this regard, because in the past sometimes, like, I would get into this pattern where every single time I didn't get a 5/0, I'd change something in my deck. But, you know, the saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. You know, that's a little bit misleading. It's partially true, but the statement should be, if you do the same thing again and again under identical circumstances, like where everything is exactly the same, and you expect different results, then that's insanity. And I would agree, but you see, the problem is there's no situation in either Magic or life where the circumstances are ever going to be exactly identical. So you can't necessarily just assume that because something didn't work out, that if you do it again, it's also not going to work out again. I mean, I'll give the perfect example in poker of like, imagine you've got pocket aces in Texas Hold'em. You know, I don't know how many of you guys have played Texas Hold'em, but, you know, I remember when that was popular, everybody started getting into it. But anyway, the point of Texas Hold'em is you have 2 cards instead of 5. So basically, if you have 2 aces in your hand and you play them together with 5 cards that eventually come out on the table, and everybody shares those 5 cards, but the 2 hidden cards in your hand are what separates your hands from everybody else. But the point is, if you have pocket aces, let's say you have pocket aces, the opponent, one of your opponents moves all in. That means, you know, you either call or you fold. There's no other play. Unless somebody else moves all in over that player, but, you know, let's just assume it's you and one other opponent. So they go all in, you have pocket aces. I mean, you have to call, because you know, rationally, statistically, that is the best possible hand. You know that. Now, if you actually follow this logic that, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results, you know, like, suppose you lose, which you very easily can. I mean, your opponent still has about a 20% chance to beat that pocket aces with almost any random hand they have. It's extremely unlikely, but they could hit 3 of a kind. They could hit, you know, 2 pair. I think 2 pair is the most common way that they'll spike a win against your aces. But yeah, I mean, you know, that's a very 1 in 5 times it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen more than you'd like, but it is gonna happen. And so, you know, let's suppose they beat that pocket aces hand. So then, like, imagine the next hand, the exact same thing happens. You have pocket aces, they move all in again. Or I guess you bet they move all in over you, because technically the button moved. But anyway, but the point is, same situation, they end up going all in. What are you going to do? Call or fold? I mean, you can't fold pocket aces before the flop. It's literally the best possible hand. I mean, so if you follow that logic of doing the same thing again and again, you know, expecting different results is insanity, well, you'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to follow this logic exactly like it said. And I mean, last time, when I called with pocket aces, I lost. Hence, if I do the same thing again, then that's insanity, because, I mean, how could I expect any different result? But see what I mean? The problem is, how the cards are going to come out in a game of poker is not identical. And you could say, oh, in real life, like, you know, you know, there isn't chance. It's not like poker. Like, there isn't, like, cards that come out of a deck. I don't know what to say to those people other than that. I don't think they've lived life very, you know, too long, if they don't think there's any random element to life. But, like, no, there's the reason why life is random, like poker, is because just like poker isn't really random if you think about it. I mean, those cards in the deck, they're whatever they are. The thing that makes it random is we don't know what those cards are, and that's why life is random too, because it's the same thing. The events that are going to come up in our life, the people we're going to meet, etc., etc. Well, I mean, you know, obviously they have free will too, depending on, you know, whether you believe in free will or not. I don't know if when I make philosophy videos, but yes, I think I'm technically a libertarian free will believer. And by the way, you can believe in libertarian free will and not be a political libertarian, but that's just the technical philosophical term for people who believe in free will. And that's important because there's also people who call themselves, there are people who say they believe in free will, but they believe in a theory called compatibilism, and I'm not a compatibilist, so my understanding is that makes me a libertarian free will believer. That being said, that does not commit me to the idea that, like, there's also believers in so-called radical free will, that, like, we have control over, like, every single possible choice we can make. I'm not committed to that idea. I think there's probably a lot of choices that we think we had a choice on, but we really didn't. But, you know, philosophically, basically, if you believe that you have choice over any possible thing, even if it's the smallest of possible things, even if it's just literally, you know, whether or not, for example, you sleep in 1 extra minute or not. Like, literally, if you have the freedom to wake up 1 minute early, and that's like the only freedom you had of anything in your life, just, you know, how early you're going to wake up, that means you're a believer in libertarian free will. That's my understanding. It's just you're just not a believer in radical free will. And I don't know to what extent we necessarily have free will, but okay, look, I'll just give you guys the rundown. I don't know. I don't know if this is, like, not the content you want in a Magic video, but I'll just give you the rundown as to why I believe in free will. It's really simple. It all just depends. It's all just like who has the burden of proof. See, here's the problem, guys. You know, folks. Who has the burden of proof with free will? I think is a misunderstood concept. Most of the deniers of free will, I think, will assert that the burden of proof is on you for believing in free will. But I disagree, and I'll explain why. Because we actually kind of have to trust the world as it appears to us. I think that's kind of a given. I mean, otherwise, like, we're basically in Descartes' you know, evil demon thought experiment, where, like, you know, where we have to doubt everything except for cogito ergo sum, and whether or not you agree with the rest of his logic about how exactly he reasoned his way out of his demon's paradox, not true paradox, but, you know, his demon's world. At the end of the day, you have to admit that, I mean, so you could go full Descartes and try to reason your way out of the demon's trap, so to speak, like basically the Matrix. I'm going to call it the Matrix. Basically, Descartes asked the question, how do we know we're not in the Matrix? And I guess now that's rearing its ugly head again in the simulation theory. Because the simulation theory is basically just a variation of Descartes' you know, evil demon world. That he speculated, how do we know an evil demon didn't create, like, a false world that's deceiving us? And by the way, that idea also is not necessarily completely unique to Descartes. He didn't come up with that first either. Actually, there was this group of you know, what were considered heretical Christians before, called Gnostics, that believed that basically an evil god had created a false world. I mean, essentially the Matrix, and I guess the false god would be like the architect or something. I don't know, but just people didn't necessarily have the understanding of computer language back in those days, so they usually appealed to some type of demon or something. But the essence is the same as the Matrix. I mean, just replace demon with, like, the architect or the machines or whatever, and just replace, like, world with the Matrix. I mean, with, like, a simulated world. And yeah, the Gnostics basically believed that some kind of evil god had trapped humanity in a false world, and they believed that Jesus was actually the true God, whereas the false god was the evil god. But anyway, that's and by the way, that was my understanding is, I think the Gnostics were based on some type of earlier. I think they had some connection to some earlier Greco-Roman philosophies. I think actually the Greek philosophy of Platonism is what they had some type of ties to before you know, the time of Jesus. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is that geez, this is more of a tangent than I wanted to go into. But yeah, the point is you have to accept. I mean, you know, and full disclosure, if you follow me on Twitter, you know I'm kind of a rationalist. So, like, I don't have a problem necessarily using this logic. I need somebody to explain to me why it's irrational to believe that you can believe in any a priori truths. I'm not saying that you can like believe whatever you want and call it an a priori truth. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems to me like there has to be some a priori truths, and I think the principle that you have to accept the world as it appears to you, unless there is some, you know, compelling reason to think otherwise. I think that's kind of like an a priori truth, or you know, I think it's also called a properly basic belief in some, you know, in at least some philosophies. So at the end of the day, I do think free will actually falls into this category of how the world appears, because I think it's kind of obvious, like, to you as you live your life, that you have free will. And I'm not going to lie, folks, you know, sometimes I kind of wish I didn't have free will, because, like, it's kind of a scary thought that you have control over your life, and, like, you are, to some extent, even if not, like, completely responsible, you're at least somewhat responsible for some of your actions. You know, it's not necessarily like all guns and, I mean, it's not necessarily all, like, I'm not saying guns and roses, but I don't know, I think that's right expression. It's not all peaches and cream or whatever. I actually kind of wish free will wasn't a thing, but, like, it just really does seem it does seem kind of obvious from our day-to-day life. And so it might, unless I'm missing something, folks, I think that falls into the category of how the world appears to be, and therefore I think the burden of proof is on disbelievers in free will to convince me why I don't have free will, because that is a part of the world the way it appears to be. And I have some familiarity with some arguments about how, like, supposedly every single atom has to be moved by another atom, or every single, like, motion in the universe has to be caused by something else, and therefore ultimately like all of your actions are caused by something else. The only problem with that, though, is I'm like, well, but what if there's some kind of metaphysical consciousness, or some kind of metaphysical, I mean, you could call it a soul, but whatever, you don't necessarily have to smuggle, like, religious concepts into this to believe in it, but, whatever it is, if there's some kind of metaphysical you, whatever that you is, that is actually a cause on how the atoms in your body move to some extent, then, I mean, doesn't that solve that problem? Like, why is it that the fact that molecules and atoms and physics, require things in motion and require causes? I mean, why can't, I mean, and here's the thing, maybe actually before quantum physics, like, I'm not an expert in science or anything, so I might be totally misunderstanding this, but it is perhaps possible that under Newtonian worldview, maybe it was much harder to posit how some type of metaphysical something, whatever that might be, might possibly influence might influence your the molecules and atoms in your body and the movement. But I mean, aside from the fact that my understanding is I don't even think Newton himself necessarily believed that, which doesn't mean, by the way, I mean, Newton could have. It is possible, perhaps you could posit that Newton didn't want to accept some of the logical ramifications of some of his findings, but I mean, my understanding is Newton himself believed that there was certain divine intervention in the world and so forth, and obviously he didn't see a contradiction in metaphysical something interacting with with the world and being a cause, you could say. But anyway, some have posited that Newtonian physics didn't allow for some type of metaphysical whatever to be a cause on anything that is physical. But aside from the fact that Newton himself didn't seem to have a problem with that, I mean, we do now have like a new understanding, like, with metaphysics and with, yeah, I mean, basically with metaphysics, I mean, not metaphysics, with quantum mechanics. My understanding is that it's still not entirely known exactly why certain, I guess, quarks, which are the smallest subatomic particle, I think they phase in and out of existence, and it's kind of mysterious, like, when, where they exist, when they exist, why they exist. So, like, I don't know. So, like, again, I'm not an expert in science, but at least from sort of the pop science and this and that I've looked at, I mean, the bottom line is we don't know. So I'm not saying this proves free will. This doesn't prove free will. I'm just saying that since we still don't know a lot with quantum mechanics, we don't know how quarks behave. My understanding is there's still like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which I'm not entirely sure how that feeds into this, but there's just a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknown things about quarks, how they behave, why they behave, I think even when they exist, why they exist. So at the end of the day, since there's so much uncertainty about the smallest of subatomic particles, I'm not exactly so sure that you do have a knockdown argument to say that there isn't some possibility that some metaphysical you, whatever that metaphysical you is, can be a cause on the the physical elements in your body. But, like, again, I'm not saying that proves rule. I'm just saying, like, we start with the fact that the world, you have to trust the world the way it appears unless there's a compelling reason otherwise. And I'm sorry, especially with the advent of quantum mechanics. And again, aside from the fact that Newton himself didn't seem to see a problem with things, interfering. I mean, with, like, some metaphysical something interfering with the with physical things. I don't. Again, the burden of proof is on the other to make a compelling argument for why we shouldn't trust the world the way it is. I believe free will is a part of the world the way it appears to be. I have not heard a compelling argument that forces me to abandon that belief. In a way, I kind of want to be convinced, to be honest. Maybe I'm missing something, but I have not heard a knockdown argument yet for that. And my understanding is that I think the at least the philosophy, I think the branch of philosophy that deals with the most with free will, which I forget which one that is, but my understanding is, like, is the philosophers who study free will the most have mostly actually come around to believing it. I could be mistaken about that, don't quote me on that, but my understanding is basically when this kind of concept of properly basic beliefs and whatnot came out, it really I think it kind of changed the landscape to some extent, at least, because I think people did start to kind of understand that maybe the burden of proof was on the other side. And I ultimately think whether or not believing in free will is rational or not all comes down to who has the burden of proof. And I could be missing something there, but I actually think basically that's how you kind of have to start any rational inquiry, is you have to start with who has the burden of proof. And contrary to popular belief, I don't think you just automatically start with, I mean, I guess to some extent, I mean, obviously you have to start with whoever's making like a claim to knowledge has the burden of proof. And obviously, with my explanation about why I think the burden of proof is on the other side, that too, I guess, requires a burden of proof. And that burden of proof, I believe, is satisfied by appealing to the principle that you have to trust the world the way it is, unless you kind of have some compelling reason not to. Because otherwise you can't trust anything, and you're in Descartes' demon paradox, or the matrix, or whatever you want to call it. And you know, which again, we might be. I mean, like, I'm not saying I don't think we're in the Matrix, but again, we might be. I'm not saying that I've proved the Matrix doesn't exist and we're not in it. I'm just saying I think that this is just kind of one of these principles of first reason. You just can't assume you're in the Matrix, because then you're just trapped there. And like, I mean, how do you know you're not in an infinite number of matrices? I think even in the Matrix universe, some fans are wondering, how do we know that the Matrix isn't in the world of Matrix, isn't in another Matrix? And you see, that's kind of the point, right? Like, even Neo, in a way, like he wasn't just some raving lunatic who just believed he was in the Matrix just because reasons. I mean, like, there was a lot of things kind of funky about the world, and you know, and he was inquisitive, and then he got that call from Morpheus, and like even Neo, he didn't have, you could say, blind faith, so to speak, or whatever. Like, you know, even he needed some reason to doubt the world around him, and he did, and well, whatever. Anyway, so this has gone on long enough. My point is ultimately, I don't think you should just change everything just because you didn't necessarily get the same result as last time. The world is not necessarily under the same circumstances every single time. We face different matchups. We played differently. We may not have been on our A game like we were last time. We may or may not be able to identify all of those gameplay decisions we made, and you know, how they impacted us. Just the games we played were not under identical circumstances. So yeah. All I can say is the deck felt like it ran relatively smoothly, except for the games where we didn't draw Aether Vial and we were kind of stuck on lands. And honestly, like, Repeal wouldn't have solved that issue. So, and Repeal is still here. It's just in the sideboard. So if we, you know, it's still here. You know, we just won't see it as often because we won't see it in game one. I don't know, man. Like, it is possible. Maybe Repeal should replace Spreading Seas, because it is a pretty sweet. Sort of Swiss Army knife type tool that I think is extremely underrated. Oh geez, after giving that long explanation, am I just talking myself into putting Repeal in the main? I don't know, maybe later. We'll see. I think the 8Cs concept, there was nothing about those leagues that made me think that 8Cs was not going to ever have viability. So I guess we'll see. I mean, again, the theory is that Spreading Seas is at worst always a card that replaces itself. It can fix your mana sometimes if you really need it. Yeah, at the worst it replaces itself, like I said. It can enable Island Walk. It can color screw them sometimes. With Ren and 6, it's less likely to happen. But I mean, it's got a lot of good things going for it. Relatively few things. Repeal's good too, but you know, I don't know. We'll see. Alright, anyway, I've ranted on long enough. Anyway, if you guys like this content, like and subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications, and you know, leave a comment, all that good stuff. And you guys have a wonderful day. Y'all folks, take care. All right.